Are we live, Dr. Sanjay?
Yes, we are live.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our third webinar in the series of IEEE standards sessions. And this is the 12th webinar in the series of R10 talks. IEEE Standards Association has been collaborating with the IEEE Region 10 to provide a series of webinars highlighting some of the key work that's happening in Standards Association. We did a first webinar on the introduction to the IEEE SA and engaging with the standards organization, followed by a second webinar in July, which was on distributed energy resources. Today, we bring to you a webinar on building trust on systems using IEEE standards. And we have three eminent speakers as part of this particular webinar. Next slide, please. So our first speaker is Ms. Ruth Lewis. She is a Bachelor of Engineering in Electrical and also a Master of Strategic Foresight. And she is also registered with the Engineers Australia National Engineering Register. And she will be talking about IEEE AI ethics and governance. She'll be focusing both on the standards aspects as well as certification. Following Ruth Lewis, we have a set of two speakers, Mrs. Dr. Katina Michael, who is a senior member of the IEEE, and she's a professor with the Arizona State University and a senior global futures scientist with the Global Futures Laboratory, and Dr. Roba Abbas, who is a senior lecturer of operations and systems in the Faculty of Business and Law at the University of Wollongong in Australia. And they will be talking about soft law for age-appropriate digital design for children, a case study on IEEE 2089, which was published in 2021. Without much further ado, I welcome all of you to this particular webinar. All the attendees will be on a mute. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please do post them on the chat window. What we will do is we will have both the talks in sequence, and we will take the Q&A after the end of the two talks. With that, I will hand it over to Ms. Ruth Lewis. Over to you, Ruth.
You. Can you see my slides okay?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, sorry. How about that?
Yep.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you. And
Thank
hi,
you.
everyone. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Ruth Lewis, and I'm here to present on IEEE's AI Ethics and Governance Standards and Certification. And thank you very much for the invitation to Region 10 to organise this fabulous webinar to talk about this important topic. So, sorry, just go back for a minute. Let me just briefly reintroduce myself, and thank you for the kind introduction, Sri. I've had many years in the IT industry as Sri mentioned, as a telecommunications engineer and as a strategic IT consultant. And as Sri mentioned, completed a master's in strategic foresight, which means I'm actually also an academically qualified futurist. Now, during my foresight course, we were actually encouraged to go out and make a difference in the world. So I became involved in the development of international standards in ethical artificial intelligence and emerging technology. And since then, I've taken on additional roles, including as chair of the IEEE Society for Social Implications of Technology Standards Committee in a voluntary capacity. And I also have my own consultancy called Technology Foresight, and I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. So this is what we'll cover in my short presentation. Firstly, for those who aren't familiar, I'll start with a quick introduction to the IEEE and its Standards Association, and then discuss the opportunities and the challenges of AI development. And then I'll give a bit of an overview of the IEEE Standards Association's ethical AI standards and the certification program and how these address the AI development challenges. So the IEEE, or formerly known as the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, is the world's largest technical professional organisation, and it's dedicated to advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. IEEE and its members inspire the global community through its highly cited publications, conferences, technology standards, and professional and educational activities. Although headquartered in the USA, IEEE actually has over 427,000 members in more than 190 countries, and more than 64% of these are actually from outside the US. It has 10 geographic regions worldwide. Obviously, we are speaking from region 10. Which of course is the most important one, and 39 technical societies representing a wide range of technical interests, publishing more than 200 transactions, journals, and magazines. IEEE Standards Association aims to develop global standards in order to advance global technologies and their platforms and promote innovation, public safety, health, and well-being, and contributing to a sustainable future. It has an active portfolio of more than 1,000 published standards and more than 1,000 standards projects under development, with contributors from all around the world under development. And this includes, of course, the prominent IEEE 802 network standards like Wi-Fi, as well as the IEEE 7000 standards for ethical AI that I will talk about today. Now, this development of AI systems brings a huge IT opportunity. From an economic view of earning around, it's projected around $1 trillion by 2026, and an optimistic view for a growing field of hundreds of AI use cases to solve humanity's problems. Now, imagine being able to generate efficient, sustainable energy, reverse climate change, diagnose and treat cancers, control epidemics, and maybe solve the world's food crisis. AI's ability is driven by the availability of data, historical data, embedded devices, connectivity, processing power, open source software and data, deep learning methods, and of course, financial returns that are increasing all of the time through subsidies and through demand. However, the pessimistic view is that while society has the smarts, it doesn't have the wisdom to develop these powerful new technologies. Evidence to support this view includes personal privacy violations, technology addiction, fake news generation, human bias, and some of the more recent things that have emerged, like moral and ethical issues around personalized chatbots, such as companion chatbots who are touted to be suitable for lonely or perhaps psychologically distressed people. All of these are examples which are based on AI without consideration of societal ethical values, often only economic gain or efficiency and productivity as a goal. A recent global survey by KPMG and the University of Queensland in Australia has shown that there is a deep distrust of AI embedded into automated decision-making systems. Within Region 10 countries, the highest trust and acceptance of AI is actually found to be within India and China, and the lowest within countries like South Korea, Singapore, Japan, and Australia. With this distrust, up to about 80% of the population, which is really significant. So to counter some of these issues of distrust, There are increasing market drivers that demand ongoing and demonstrated trustworthy engagements at multiple levels and touchpoints. And this includes soft or socio-technical attributes that are really difficult to demonstrate compliance to the marketplace without accepted and proven certification schemes from recognised entities. And now, of course, draft regional regulations which seek to encourage socio-technical considerations to be implemented in situations where the risk is either unacceptable or high risk. And yet there is still no evident test or standardized approach that an entity can rely upon immediately without undertaking an additional risk of further testing fees or AI solutions perhaps being deployed and then having to be recalled. And of course, cities and governments that are tasked with procuring technologies with embedded or hosted AI systems require the means to properly vet the ethical AI concerns and considerations to ensure citizens and residents are treated consistently and in the most trustworthy manner possible. So to try and guide the market, national governments and intergovernment agencies such as the OECD, UNESCO and others, like in Australia, promote a set of trustworthy AI principles. And they do this to promote the use of AI that respects human rights and human values. And this is what is called a soft law approach. Looking at these principles, and I've got them in 3 columns here, can you see anything in common? Maybe I'll give you a hint. So I've actually color-coded them here. So if you can see through the color coding, they're actually all the same. So for example, in this sort of reddy pink color, you've got issues like, or principles like inclusive growth, sustainability, well-being, and then in OECD, and then under UNESCO, sustainability. Australia promotes exactly the same: human, societal, environmental well-being. In the purple, under UNESCO, OECD, you've got human-centered values and fairness. Under UNESCO, pretty much the same thing. Do no harm as well. And under Australia, again, the same, but does mention algorithmic bias. In the yellow, robustness, security and safety, very similar under UNESCO. And then Australia, very, very similar, reliability and safety and security. Again, green, transparency and explainability, as well as contestability, and the light blue, accountability, responsibility, and so on. There's just one that's slightly different under UNESCO, which mentions awareness and literacy. So basically all these principles are the same, but I will talk to the awareness and literacy, which is very, very important, in a little bit. So why do you think they are all the same? Well, the reason is, well, way back in 2015, IEEE Standards Association actually started to look into this issue of trust in the emerging area of artificial intelligence, or autonomous and intelligent systems, as it was called then, to IEEE Standards Association, whilst they were developing their landmark publication called Ethically Aligned Design. The intention of ethically aligned design is to teach people to use human-centric, values-driven design methods instead of giving them lists of AI principles in isolation. Now, this publication then informed organisations like the OECD and UNESCO, as well as governments like Australia, and there are many other governments also have very similar trustworthy AI principles, and that's why they all look very similar. If you look at the way ethically aligned design is constructed, with the ethically aligned design key pillars, where you see the purple ones: universal human values, political self-determination, data agency, and technical dependability, which then evolves into the ethically aligned design general principles, including human rights, well-being, data agency, transparency, accountability, and then that dissolved into the ethically aligned design chapters, each one of them having a list of issues and a set of recommendations. And those are aligned with things like classical ethics, well-being, effective computing, meaning simulated emotions, data and individual agency, and embedding values into autonomous and intelligent systems. The recommendations made in those chapters included to develop a set of standards, which of course were kicked off during the lifetime of ethically aligned design from about 2016 onwards. And of course now many of them have actually been published. So this ethically aligned design publication is the inspiration behind the set of standards, which, as I mentioned, is partly published and partly still under development. Now, of course, we have over 30 of what we call socio-technical impact standards for AI ethics and governance. So what is a socio-technical standard? It's actually one that considers the interaction of technology, and the social and the environmental factors in developing the standard. Now, some of these standards are part of the 7000 series, starting with standard 7000 and actually currently up to standards project P7083. And I've indicated on this slide the 7 published standards in red, and the others have the designation of the prefix P for project, as I mentioned. However, there are many that are outside the 7000 designated series, which includes, of course, the IEEE 2089, which was published in 2021, the IEEE Standard for an Age-Appropriate Digital Services Framework based on the 5 rights principles of children, which, of course, the speakers following me, Katina and Roba, will be speaking directly to. But underpinning all of these standards are the principles and the practices described in ethically aligned design. And since the OECD and other trustworthy AI principles are based and inspired by ethically aligned design, these standards I've just spoken about translate directly into useful practical guides for implementing these AI ethics principles. They can be used along with the IEEE Certified Certification Program, which provides an outcomes and risk-based certification in 4 elements of AI ethics and governance. Now, looking in a little more detail at a couple of these standards, we have the IEEE 7000 itself, the standard, which was published in 2021, and that is a process to embed ethical values of our society when developing AI by identifying and by mitigating the concerns of stakeholders during system design. 7000 offers concrete processes with activities and tasks and mandatory outcomes that ensure an ethically aligned design. It is human values oriented with metrics-driven technology used at the outset of design. And this standard has been adopted by the ISO IEC as ISO IEC IEEE 24749-7000 in 2022 under SC7 in its entirety. Then we have the IEEE 7010 published in 2020, the recommended practice for assessing the impact of autonomous and intelligent systems on human well-being. This standard helps AI systems creators and policy makers to ask the critical question: what are we optimizing our AI systems to do as key performance indicators of societal success? 7010 provides an impact assessment methodology at the outset of design, and this requires users of the standard to identify, globally validated indicators focusing on issues of human well-being and environmental sustainability in complement to existing financial and growth metrics, which are often the only KPIs considered in autonomous and intelligent systems development and use. So what we measure matters. For AI to benefit all humans and all society, we must take human well-being and environmental sustainability into full account in design and in policy and in its use by moving beyond the status quo of how we currently measure success. I'd also like to give you a brief introduction to the IEEE Society on Social Implications of Technology, or SSIT Standards Committee. As I mentioned before, I'm the chair of this Standards Committee, and we actually have 17 standards projects under development in this portfolio. It's quite a diverse portfolio of what I'd call applications of autonomous and intelligent systems, including those I've designated in green with a strong environmental focus. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the standards project in the corner on the bottom left, at least on my screen, IEEE P3119. Talk a little more about that. It's actually the standard for the procurement of AI and automated decision systems, which aims to address the needs of government workers, of policymakers, and technologists to make meaningful and accountable choices that are transparent about the socio-technical considerations and the impact of AI products and services and systems on the public. Now, this particular standards project is reasonably mature, and they've actually developed a draft process for their standard, and they have made an offer to engage with any government departments or agencies who would like to trial this standards processes whilst they're in development against real use cases. So if you do know of any suitable situations or use cases that and government departments who might like to engage with this standards project, please get in touch with me after this presentation. Okay, moving from standards then to think about organizational risk. And one thing that has remained concerningly consistent, and that is the level of risk mitigation that organizations engage in to bolster digital trust. And as you can see from this slide, which is an excerpt from a McKinsey study from last year, whilst the AI use has actually increased, research, or McKinsey's research, has shown that there has actually been no substantial increase in reported mitigation of any AI-related risks from 2019 until last year, until now. And that is why the IEEE Standards Association has introduced the IEEE Certified Certification Program to help instill trustworthiness between organizations that are providing AI-driven services and the consumer. IEEE Certified conveys a number of messages. Firstly, it affirms an organization's commitment to human values, to dignity and to well-being, and to respecting and protecting and preserving fundamental human rights. It conveys an organization's capability to fulfill applicable transparency, accountability, reduction in algorithmic bias, and privacy requirements, as well as fostering trust and facilitating the adoption and use of AI solutions. It also enhances confidence in public and private enterprises that wish to realize the benefits of AI ethics certification in the absence of, or maybe as a complement to, broadly accepted and enforced regulations for AI, whilst mitigating risks, their liabilities, and adverse impacts on their reputation and their market share. IEEE certified is broadly compatible with upcoming regulatory frameworks such as the European Union's AI Act. So there you have the entire IEEE Standards Association ecosystem, going from principles with ethically aligned design and its various publications, including Introduction to Trustworthy AI, Ethics and Sustainable Innovation, as I mentioned, promoted to foster AI literacy and knowledge, to standards, including trustworthy AI by design, but not exclusively, and then to market acknowledgement through the IEEE Certified AI Ethics Certification Program and the IEEE Mark of Trust, and with it the training for assessors and audit and registration, as well as strategic partners. And I do want to also mention that the very next Asia Pac compatible timing assessor training is scheduled on the 13th to the 16th of November this year, and it will be based in Singapore time, I understand. So if anyone is interested, please note that QR code I've got on the screen, and that'll take you to the registration page for that particular certified assessor training. IEEE Standards Association's Trustworthy AI Portfolio, ethically aligned design, as I mentioned, all its iterations, is built on deep public engagement and research. The standards which have been published, the reports, and the first level of the certified ontological specifications for ethical trustworthiness are all available for free public access for improved understanding, to enable organizations to differentiate and to build competencies and methodologies to achieve the status of a trustworthy organization. So just in summary, the demand for trustworthy systems will continue to grow for the foreseeable future, but addressing trustworthy AI system implementations continues to be of interest for all market stakeholders. The IEEE Standards Association's adaptive and customizable approach will support your AI digital transformation journey from principles to practice, with its publications, its standards, the training, and the certified adaptive risk certification methodology. And the IEEE Trustworthy AI Portfolio is available now for free public access to encourage awareness, literacy, and action. Thank you very much for your attention. As mentioned, my name's Ruth Lewis. That's my email address on the slide, and please feel free to contact me with any questions, but I understand that there will be an opportunity to put your questions or address your questions in the chat after the next panelist, which is Katina and Roba. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for this presentation. I wanted to mention a couple of things. One is the presentations will be shared. The recording will be hosted on the R10 webpage. So people, if they want to refer to anything specific, they can look at that. And also there is a Q&A window where you can post your questions. So I encourage people to post questions on the Q&A window. With that, I now invite Dr. Katina Michael and Dr. Roba Abbas for their talk on IEEE 2089. Thank you, Katina and Roba. You might want to go on slide mode, Katina.
folks. Thank you so much, Ruth, as well. I may have a toggle issue with our PowerPoint, but let's just wait a moment and see if that will come through. While we're waiting for the slide to come up, I just wanted to say what an incredible congruence we have in our presentation today with Dr. Roba Abbas, with Ruth Lewis. It's wonderful to see that synergy, and you always know that you're onto something good when the talks are aligned and the speakers have not, in fact, perhaps planned it that way. So without further ado, let's see if this screen share will work this time. I think it will. And can everyone see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Professor Katina.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you, Shri, for this invitation to talk to Region 10. It's an honor, as always, to be asked to speak on behalf of IEEE. And first, I'll begin by saying I'm Katina Michael, and I was the working group chair of IEEE 2089, and with me is co-presenter Dr. Roba Abbas, and she was a working group member of IEEE 2089, a standard that took approximately 2 years to go from beginning to end. I would say one of the fastest standards to be enacted and commenced, and for that I congratulate the 30 or so named members on the standard who worked concertedly, month in, month out, and I would say towards the end in particular, the last 6 months, almost on a weekly, sometimes nightly basis. And this is because this standard is really important. It affects such a huge part of the population with whom we name children or youth, inclusive of babies even, and those who are under the age of 18. We want to begin by emphasizing that standards are examples of archetypal soft law. Now, Ruth mentioned soft law in her presentation, but according to the OECD, soft law is defined as cooperation based on instruments that are not legally binding, like hard law, or whose binding force is somewhat weaker than traditional law. And here we can refer to different things. Already, we heard Ruth identify principles as being soft law, but in addition to that, we can talk about codes of conduct, guidelines, roadmaps, peer reviews, and so much more. But to begin, as always, an honor to be introducing my collaborator of 17 years, a brief introduction here of Dr. Roba Abbas, who was a working group member, again, of IEEE 2089. Roba, I consider to be one of the world's leading social technical theoreticians. There aren't many of these around, though so many people claim they know socio-technical. I think Dr. Abbas understands the history and evolution and application of socio-technical theory towards socio-technical design and operationalization. It's taking those principles and doing something with them in action, and this is what we believe our standard actually does. Dr. Abbas has wide experience, but particularly on projects that have had to do with co-designing digital services for children, large-scale technical systems, and corresponding regulatory responses. She has professional expertise in web design and development, and in our repertoire are cross-sections of skills that lend themselves to modeling and analysis of complex systems to address real-world challenges. Of myself, I can say I have a background in information and communication technology and law, but also I herald from Arizona State University, where I'm a joint hire in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and also the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence. And I also run a research group that's focused on society, policy, engineering, and we call ourselves SPEC, a collective. And we focus on the social implications of technology, but the policy responses and the way to embed values in engineering designs. I'm a board member of a non-government organization, the Australian Privacy Foundation, the oldest privacy foundation in the world, and I've been very happy to be supporting in an advocacy role the importance of privacy and security through design. I've previously worked on diverse sets of standards, including those to do with forensics. The Australian standard related to forensics, there's 5 specifically, CH041 series, where in 2010 I was able to embed myself as a consumer representative as part of the Consumer Federation of Australian NGO. We have a threefold mission today. It's to demonstrate how soft law informs hard law, is to depict the socio-technical landscape in context, and is to describe the embedding of age-appropriate digital design in innovation processes and regulation. We don't develop standards so they gain dust on an online platform. We design standards and bring them into commencement so that we can apply them in a real-world context. The question is how? And so we begin our session by focusing on how we demonstrate how soft law informs hard law. So here we are presented with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's to emphasize that this is not a treaty and it's not legally binding, but perhaps everybody thinks about the importance of human rights. In fact, in Article 25, number 2, we can see the importance focused on motherhood and childhood, and that they're entitled to special care and assistance. We ask ourselves why this is so important historically, and perhaps contextually as important today as it was when this declaration was created. We also point to delving deeper into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC as it's known commonly, also an initiative of the United Nations, and understanding how the convention is different to a treaty or a declaration. And so the convention is commonly known as a legally binding international agreement. That's what the UNCRC is. Legally binding international agreement, setting out the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of every child without discrimination. The agreement was ratified by 195 state parties. The only countries that have not ratified the treaty are Somalia and, interestingly enough, the United States. But in this convention, we have a definition of what a child is. It's anyone under the age of 18. And treaties are considered agreements, as we said. It's a form of hard law in the context of international law. Treaties are legally binding settlements involving two or more parties, nations, groups, organizations, or interests. Now let's have a closer look at the articles of interest with respect to children on this slide. Let's look at Article 3, the best interests of a child. All organizations concerned with children should work towards what is best for a child. And of course, that's just as appropriate in digital services. What's best for a child when they are online? Respect for children's views. Children have the right to say what they think should happen when adults are making decisions that affect them. And of course, we've taken this top-down approach when we build services for children online. We believe we know what's best for them without asking them, but things are slowly changing in the sector. Point 16, protection of privacy of a child. Children have the right to privacy. The law should protect them from attacks against their way of life. And already over the last 5 years, we have seen breaches in the rights of children's privacy through digital platforms selling services or offering them to the mass market. Access to information is number 17. Children have the right to reliable information, not disinformation. And the mass media, such as television, radio, newspapers, and I would say the internet today, should provide information that children can understand, which is integral to 2089. Also, what is being targeted at children is just as important. What are we advertising to them? Number 31, the rest, play, culture, and the arts. Children have the right to relax, play, and join in a wide range of leisure activities. Increasingly, children's leisure activities are found online. But if they have the right to relax, things like auto-scrolling may be affecting their ability to relax or to play without being surveilled. Number 32, protection from harmful work. Already we can see that children online are exposed to social media walls, and sometimes when they become reputationally popular, they are enslaved to a process of feedback online, whether that's posting on walls of their own or interacting with followers, in some cases tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of followers. So there are protections in place with fair work with respect to children online. Protection from exploitation. Children should be protected from any activities that could harm their development. And we see this continuously online when harmful content is shared.
Thank you so much, Professor Michael, and thank you so much for the invitation too. We're delighted to be here. We'll now move on to our second objective, which is how do we depict the socio-technical landscape in the context of digital design for children? And Ruth did a brilliant job of pointing to the importance of the socio-technical in the previous talk. So the socio-technical context speaks to notions of theorizing, of conceptualizing, and of introducing appropriate methodologies for understanding the relationship between innovation and technology. So in this context, those digital services intended for children and the children themselves within a broader stakeholder ecosystem. And we'll get to that point of the stakeholder or stakeholders in a moment. So this includes questions regarding regulation and the rights of the child. A valid question here is which stakeholders or actors are responsible for the design, for the development, and for the delivery of digital services to children? And there are many other related questions, so let's look at a few. So whose responsibility is it to ensure that the relevant UNCRC articles, those that Katina just referenced, are not only visible, but are also implemented in practice, so that they are operationalized within the context of the digital services themselves? And related to this point is the question of through which mechanisms is this achievable? These questions are pertinent, particularly as we're observing recently that there are a multitude of breaches and subsequent penalties that have been issued to global organizations. So certainly a variety of digital practices and services are being questioned as a result as they relate to children and children's data. So let's look at a few examples. For instance, how has the data of the child handled issues around monetization? Katina used a few examples at the moment or previously. The child's right to privacy. What do we do about targeted advertisement and also about product placement and so much more as aligned with the UNCRC? And as we mentioned in our abstract to this talk, and we can reiterate again here, one size does not fit all. So the services that are designed and developed for adults cannot immediately or automatically be extended to children. And this appears to be a reasonable statement if we're to think about it logically, yet we can still point to many privacy and other breaches. So on the next slide, I think it might be helpful for us to unpack why this might be the case. So why there have been so many significant privacy and other violations by corporations. And there are studies to suggest that an underlying reason for the breaches or for such breaches is related to the pacing problem. As you'll note on the slide here, the pacing problem is defined as, and I quote, the growing gap between the pace of technology and the lagging responsiveness of legal and ethical oversight that society relies on to govern emerging technologies, end quote. This points to speedy innovation processes on the part of organizations without the corresponding governance mechanisms in place, thereby resulting in vulnerabilities, for instance, the mishandling of children's data and privacy and other breaches. There have been a range of other questions that are posed in addition to those I previously mentioned when considering this socio-technical framing and the depiction that we spoke about as part of this objective. And we're suggesting here that these considerations relate to the types of stakeholders that are actively involved in innovation processes and in the design and development initiatives themselves. So questions such as, is the issue related to a gap perhaps in skill set within organizations, specifically with respect to these governance mechanisms or to governance in general of such innovation and design and development projects? For example, do we need perhaps dedicated privacy, security or socio-technical advocates within the organization, or the corporations themselves to guide innovation and technology related processes? Or are there other requirements that we perhaps are overlooking that could assist in this context? An alternate ID posed to the pacing problem relates to the nature of innovation and discovery in general, whereby organizations are committed to the innovation and design and development processes or agendas and believe that they have the ability to absorb the associated risks. And today you've heard about that term of risks more than once. And Katina will pick up and return to that point as it relates to IEEE Standard 2089. And Ruth mentioned that previously in terms of risk mitigation requirements and so on. But first, on the next slide, it might be helpful to elaborate on the on some of the emergent dynamics that could be a result of how we characterize, perceive, and therefore engage with innovation and technology related processes within those socio-technical systems or ecosystems. A dominant model is displayed on the current slide in the Henderson-Clark model of innovation, providing somewhat of a typology for innovation, where we have innovation characterized as being radical, architectural, modular, and incremental. And this is significant, in fact, for how we consider the socio-technical landscape concerning digital services design in general, but more specifically in this context for children. So if we look to radical innovations, these are those innovations that are, or those developments that are infrequent but have a significant impact on children. So for example, if you're thinking about VR headsets, they have this impact by considerably redefining the nature of the market and current service offerings, typically through breakthrough technologies and developments. We also have architectural innovations that can have significant changes or encourage significant changes in the way children interact at that configurational level with specific digital services through, for instance, ID bridges, which allow for a single sign-on between online applications. Then there are your modular innovations that have high component impact, and there's an example there on your screen. And finally, incremental innovations. And these innovations are, in fact, in abundance and build on existing technologies and innovations in a gradual sense. And they may perhaps go unnoticed, particularly in view of their relative impact to those radical innovations that we spoke of previously. So next we have some examples pointing to some of the vulnerabilities where children are concerned. So if we look to the first example, it illustrates the impacts of unchecked monetization and excessive spending within the apps themselves and in children using iPads, for example, and in-app purchases. The second points to inbuilt features that inevitably impact on usability of digital services. For example, autoplay features that Katina spoke about and identified, which may often result in children viewing continuously and not really seeking a legitimate break. Another example relates to mental health concerns and challenges in the form of, for instance, self-diagnosis advertisements. And there's the last example, which I won't delve into too much in the interest of time, but there are many such examples and instances that we can point to of digital services usage by and the related impacts and risks on children. With this in mind, on the next slide, what might reduce the number of breaches and such usability scenarios among others? So what is required if we think about this particular socio-technical landscape? So we've listed some items that we believe need highlighting and elevating as part of this discussion. In the first instance, in addition to depicting the socio-technical landscape, there's a requirement for us to actually revisit our socio-technical objectives. So are we concerned with money? Are we concerned with offering the appropriate services to end users? Is it both? And as Ruth mentioned, is efficiency and productivity the goal, and so eloquently put, or are we interested in the values themselves, the ethics? What are our KPIs and what are we measuring? Is this emphasis or objective about the human values, about ethics, or about otherwise? So we need a very clear definition about that socio-technical objective. The next is introducing notions of the public interest. So defining what it means to design and develop in the public interest, and how do we tap into appropriate public interest technology frameworks toward operationalization, and actually ensuring that our services satisfy child's needs and that broader stakeholder ecosystem, the competing interests within that. Next, if we were to look at the methodological level, it's about really implementing processes of co-design with children rather than designing digital services for children. So to ensure what they value as being privileged on what is on what the organizational measures might be, for example. And this involves embedding values by design as part of that next point, ensuring that privacy and security are incorporated in the actual design of the new technologies, not so much as an afterthought, but very much embedded within the actual feature sets themselves. And last but not least is about considering soft law, perhaps embedded within corporate social responsibility charters in support of hard law in the form of international treaties. And Ruth already introduced to us the importance of soft law. On the next slide, we really depict here a broad perspective of what this might actually look like, or what this might look like in reality. We can see how the law can manifest from national laws in the form of acts to regulatory instruments to the actual compliance and enforcement where penalties might ensue regarding a particular breach, for example. In terms of the role of soft binding law in this context, this can include standards that can be embedded in subordinate legislation, that is a regulation, and also the compliance measures that might be enforceable. Compliance is really about the state of being in accordance with established guidelines or specifications. And in terms of digital services, for example, we might be complying with a specific standard, such as standard 2089, which is what we're pointing to as part of this presentation as being that specification. So these are in fact the controls that allow for adherence to a rule around the protection of a child. And in terms of what this means in context on the following slide, it's important to point that soft law can come in the form of diverse initiatives. Therefore, if individual organisations do the right thing by a child or by children, then corporate social responsibility soft law initiatives would be entirely complementary to hard law. Although there is some skepticism in the literature, so some of the literature is divided on the topic, with some theorists asking and questioning whether soft law comprises hard law or destabilizes the normative system by undermining it. There are some typical forms of soft law that corporations are interested in, and that they might wish to consider as part of their social responsibility charters. And these can be wide-ranging, could include things such as statements and principles, codes of conduct and codes of practice, for example, could be recommendations and guidelines, it could be policy declarations, for example, and those types of communications and action plans, of which we can also incorporate standards as part of that list of initiatives.
Thank you so much, Roba, for that socio-technical landscape overview in context of children's rights online. We now go to our third objective, where we describe the embedding of age-appropriate digital design in the innovation process and regulation. So let's begin by recapping on what is this new standard 2089. It's titled the IEEE Standard for an Age-Appropriate Digital Services Framework based on the 5 rights principles for children. That standard is freely downloadable so long as you enter your details, which is a key thing when you're trying to introduce a standard to become embedded within practice. Again, a standard is a mechanism of soft law, and this standard was championed initially by Baroness Beban-Kidron, who's also a member of the House of Lords in the UK, and this standard has had a major impact on raising awareness about children's rights. She has done so both in the UK and internationally, and we're now seeing statewide based initiatives, for example, in the state of California in the US, in Australia, in terms of a code for children's rights, and many other places. So we're starting to see these developments sprout across the world. But UNICEF and perhaps this particular standard IEEE has enacted have championed this sort of revolution. That's what I would call it. So 2089 is just the beginning of a suite of standards. We've also got one currently under deliberation, which is privacy preserving age verification, which notes how we identify that a child is actually under the age of 18. In addition, a separate standards effort that I was involved in earlier in the year from last year was the Sensenelec workshop, which is a collaboration which has now been enacted. It's the European Reference Document for Children's Protection and Wellbeing Online. That was actually based on the 2089 standard of IEEE. That is a huge initiative, this CWA, because it will function to describe and aid a specific impact rating system and guidance for evaluating criteria, and will set out how vendors, public institutions, and the educational sector can meet these criteria. So it's one thing to put out a standard, it's another way to go some part into conveying how stakeholders will adopt that standard and embed it in their daily practice. Now, they could be educational sector representatives, they could also be vendors that offer these services online, and we know many of the popular names today, or they could be government agencies who are overseeing digital services initiatives and services in their nation state or their province. If we look at the 5 pillars of 2089, we see here that the framework actually identifies the need for what? Recognizing child users and meeting their needs and diversity, upholding children's rights, child-centered approaches to data use, moderation and redress, and finally, presenting published terms in age-appropriate formats. Now, if you recall back to the UNCRC that we went through in terms of each article, you can see how some of these align directly to those different articles in the UNCRC. We begin with a preparatory phase in the standard. We go through these 5 underpinning framework pillars, and then we implement the age-appropriate digital services framework, take into consideration as well this new risk-based age-appropriate design and development, where we start to begin to talk about risk registers. And finally, once we've implemented the standard in our practice, what we do after deployment and through operations is to look at it continuously and monitor until a service is decommissioned. This should form, for any organization that touches on children's rights, the underpinning practices of those organizational transactions and those development and design approaches. If we can identify the risks early, as Ruth and Roba said, we can mitigate them, overcome them, and create a better design process. So it's really about embedding this process, embedding this standard in the actual practice, everyday practice of different stakeholder types. Now, how might this be done? How can I think about it? Well, you can look at your present mode of operation. You can ask yourself, if you're a company today, how is design done in my organization? Obviously, there is some existing life cycle, there is some practice. You start to compare perhaps the change agent, which we've called as in IEEE 2089, and see where you can enhance your development and design processes. Are children being taken into consideration when offering mass market digital services? And if not, what do we do? How do we incorporate the various kinds of roles and responsibilities that we identify in the appendices in IEEE 2089? How do I incorporate them? Often, there aren't many people that are employed in large organizations that focus on children's services alone. And here we are calling for more resources. We are calling for people to identify themselves as related to perhaps user experience or user design of children's services, and having champions in management that actually hold those kinds of titles. So what if I'm a tech startup and I want to adopt 2089 from the outset? It's probably a good idea. It can be considered a benchmark. And what are the advantages of doing that instead of perhaps a original, a different kind of approach that does not take into consideration 2089? How might I incorporate international standards to inform my internal design practices if they already exist? Have I thought about soft law at all beyond standardization? Can IEEE 2089 enhance the way I do digital services design in my corporation? Do I maintain an age-appropriate risk register? And some of you might be asking, what is that? And Roba and I will introduce you to that shortly. Are my innovation processes documented using business standards for auditability? Do I talk about risks in my organization, document them, and then identify how I treat them? How do I mitigate consumer issues, especially for children when they arise? And there we are going towards a future mode of operation once that change agent is introduced. The question is, might I invest in new design roles in my organization? For example, an age-appropriate lead, a transparency manager, a child rights advocate, someone who has the interests, or people that have the interests of children at heart. That's their primary aim, is when they're building services that affect children, to think about the rights of a child based on international binding law or soft law. And how might I implement that age-appropriate risk register towards continual improvement practices in my agency or organization? Now, here's a picture from the age-appropriate risk register section of IEEE 2089. It's a generic one where we identify a line, a dotted line there in red, between what is acceptable perhaps and what needs to be questioned. If I can accept and own the risk, I do so, and then I offer the service and provide evidence why I can accept and own that risk, particularly if it's of high importance and the reward is somewhat high as well. If I need to treat a risk, those items are in my top right of my graph, and I identify how I will treat the risks and how I will make them acceptable so they can shift towards the lower part of the graph. And so I do this by going through a design cycle, by brainstorming, by engaging children and consulting with them, and proving with evidence that there will be no harm to children if I offer different incremental innovation. This goes back to Roba's wonderful introduction there by Henderson and Clark of the innovation process, of the pacing process and the pacing problem. Here's an example based on real-world literature of things that perhaps are unacceptable, at least in terms of what the law has identified in certain jurisdictions, versus what risks I can accept and own and then continue on with. If I know that auto-scrolling, for example, if we start with the top left, is a feature that can be disabled because it disrupts the ability for a child to make an independent choice of whether to stop or continue surfing, for example, social media platforms, then I can disable that. I can accept and own the risk. I can allow there to be a button where I turn on auto-scrolling, but by default it is off. Again, privacy preserving single sign-on for apps. Is that a problem if we can sign on to 5 different applications at once so that I become engaged with multiple applications across a platform and I don't have the ability to remove myself? But if I can accept and own that risk, how can I do it? Perhaps remind the user to sign in every 4th or 5th attempt. That is something I can accept and own and move on. Same with AI clients on apps that can be deleted, not there by force. I can identify many social media platforms and services that by force enable AI clients within the app and don't allow children to disable that function. Inclusive of biometrics not retained by multiverse style apps, child-generated content not unsold, that's personal data, for example, and children's data is encrypted and remains private. These are all ways I can accept an incremental innovation and make it acceptable within the context. But things like retaining children's voices or videos in the cloud when they're transacting with a platform, or turning on the geolocation feature by default so I know where the child is physically on a social media app, or nudging children towards in-game purchasing, for example, of armor in games. Is this acceptable? And the question here is, how do organizations come forth and say, well, no, we know that this is a problem. We've received feedback from the community, from parents, from other stakeholders. We need to treat this risk, and if we treat it, it can become an acceptable item so long as the child has a choice and so long as the rights of a child are upheld. So just quickly here on the next slide, we can see in implementing the IEEE 2089, there are a number of processes here that we can point to. A1, for example, describes how we prepare using a panel of stakeholders, consulting with diverse ranges of children and parents and other stakeholders, where we talk about common hazards and risks, and we record the intentional and unintentional impacts so that we can come back and establish an age-appropriate risk register that we can start to build on and work with. This is basically evidence. A bit like when you create a patent, you're creating a historical file which stores this data. Additionally, we can look at the A2, the 5 rights principles, and then the B1, the implementation of the age-appropriate digital services framework, B2, the risk register we've been talking a lot about, and C, the operations and maintenance as we continually review our practices.
To conclude and start to wrap up our presentation, I think we can deduce, based on what Katina's mentioned and what we've presented so far, or suggest that there is a close tie between corporate social responsibility initiatives or charters or perhaps plans and the adoption of standards that organisations can abide by to show their dedication or to show their support really to a particular cause. And this is to an extent an inward looking or facing process, so looking within the organisation or within an industry to better address the needs of stakeholders. We believe that there is perhaps room for a flexible approach, knowing that all forms of law, whether they're hard or soft, are required to buffer new innovations into the market as they become widely diffused. And this is also in the context of children here. So if corporate social responsibility initiatives in practice can act as catalysts for this change, then digital services can ideally or theoretically be designed and developed with age appropriateness in mind. Next, I think we can return back to the notion of design and development in the public interest on the next slide. So soft law can advocate for socially responsible behaviour and commitments to the public interest, or working in the public interest in the context of digital design for children. This is in cases where designers for children or designers of digital services for children should be championing co-design practice, but so should other stakeholders in that broader socio-technical ecosystem that we referenced earlier. Possibly corporate social responsibility messages don't just have to relate to employees within an organisation, to that internal perspective solely, but could also involve further outreach, extending this commitment and this responsibility to other stakeholders in the broader socio-technical ecosystem. And we referenced some of those stakeholders in 2089, and Katina mentioned some of those within an organisational setting that might be championing this standard and championing and advocating for age-appropriate design. It's here where the emergent role of a public interest technologist or the public interest technologist is crucial for the need to hire graduates. This is sort of going back to the role or the responsibility of educational institutions to engage in interdisciplinary scholarship and knowledge co-production. So to hire those graduates who might be interested in societal challenges in addition to technical solutions or digital services. And that would involve representation across disciplines from sociology to anthropology, law, business, and the arts. And it's also a commitment for industry to develop self-regulatory approaches where organisations and other champions drive and facilitate such initiatives. And just to wrap up, if you're interested in finding out more about 2089, Ruth mentioned SSIT. As part of that society, we have a socio-technical systems committee that Katina and I chair, where we're involved in further work related to 2089 and more broadly to socio-technical systems. So we invite you to contact us. On the next slide, we have our details there regarding either any aspect of our presentation or in general about socio-technical systems and some initiatives within the IEEE SSIT. And finally, on the last slide, we wanted to acknowledge our respective academic institutions, Arizona State University and the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, and the University of Wollongong School of Business. I would also like to thank Ruth Lewis for an excellent presentation and for being a fellow panelist, speaking about her own standards development work and experience. And just to close off, a special thank you to Sri Chandra for the invitation to present today. And we look forward to questions. Thank you, everyone. Katina, did you have any final thoughts?
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you, Roba, and thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Katina and Dr. Roba. I don't see any Q&A, but I have a couple of questions. One to perhaps Ruth, which is probably an easier one. So Ruth, the workshop that we are organizing on IEEE certified for awareness training, is it hybrid or is it in person?
Yes, it is actually, it's a virtual, not hybrid. It's the one on November the 13th to the 16th is training for assessors in certified. So you become part of the IEEE certified ecosystem, which means that you will have the training and take an examination to actually become a certified assessor of the certified criteria for trustworthy AI. Thank you. And it's,
And
as I've mentioned, in Singapore time zone, so it's highly suitable for region 10.
so I have a couple of follow-on questions, if you don't mind. So within the IEEE certified, there are 3 levels. You can become an assessor, you can become a certifying organization, or you can become train the trainer, so that you can go and train other people. Can you throw some light on it? You focused on the fact that this training is only on the assessment. If people are interested in becoming certification organizations or certification peoples, how do they do that?
Yes, thanks, Sri. Yeah, so the assessor training is the common pathway toward becoming involved in the certified ecosystem. And following on, once you become a certified assessor, either a lead assessor or an assessor, then you have the opportunity, if you have an organization, to become part of that ecosystem as a collaborator organization, and individually or collectively also providing training in certified, and actually training other assessor candidates as well as assessing other organizations on their trustworthiness of their AI according to the certified criteria. Thanks, Sri.
Thank you, Ruth. And I'm going to follow the thread with now with Dr. Katina and Roba. So I understand the fact that standards are soft law, and there is soft law, and then there's hard law. Within as Ruth talks about IEEE certified, a certification program falls somewhere in between, right? So there is a standard, then there is a hard law, and then I think Dr. Roba mentioned industry self-regulated approaches. So one such approach, perhaps, if I understood correctly, is putting together an industry-driven certification program around 2089, right, where the industry collectively comes together, and we are able to, not only the manufacturers declare that they are 2089 compliant, but a third party can actually come and validate and verify that it is actually, in fact, the truth. So is there any plan to develop such certification programs on 2089?
IEEE certainly have been considering certification for many of our standards across the board. I'd probably not officially say, the discussions that have taken place regarding that, but certainly that is the hope of standards. But certification only takes us a certain way down the track. Just because an organization is certified doesn't mean they're doing the right thing. We have many organizations today talking about co-design, talking about user consultation, stakeholder consultation, but unfortunately, the more these terms are being used, the more perhaps we are unsure if these practices are actually meeting our standard. So it is a wonderful first step for an organization to take on certification, but it doesn't mean on auditability that they are complying with, the standard. One great thing that you can point to is to say, in many cases, organizations have gone down the ISO route because they want to show they're ISO 9000 certified, as an analogy. However, in this instance, I'm going to say personally, and I know Dr. Abbas may have a different opinion or a different perspective, but I'll say it's a great first step for organizations to come on board certification. It's great that IEEE want to offer certification to demonstrate adoption within organizations, but it doesn't stop there. Enforcement in hard law requires compliance to the law. And when we start to look at that pyramid structure where Roba presented to us the law, regulation, and compliance, you would hope that a company that has, or any stakeholder that has been certified, would actually implement what they've been certified to do. However, the complexity today in organizations and the way innovation processes work doesn't always mean they're aligned. I think it's a great first step, but I wouldn't be comfortable just because an organization or a stakeholder says, I'm certified. It's great as a first step. Obviously, there has to be some alignment, but we can't relax even at that point. We're going to see penalties being served independent of whether a body is certified or not. What we really want to see is action embedded in the processes of organizations and those that collectively offer. We always say that it is everybody's responsibility to innovate responsibly. But I want to also hear another perspective, perhaps by Dr. Abbas, on this notion of certification and enforcement, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you, Katina.
Katina. Yeah, I might just jump in there. I guess there are a lot of points in which I would agree with you, Katina, about the importance for certification as a first step. Ruth spoke about its importance in the context of her standards. There was a crucial point that you did mention about the processes themselves of innovation and of design. And part of depicting the socio-technical landscape is that recognition that that landscape is continuously evolving. So having that sound theoretical understanding about the way systems work, the way open systems work, and innovation processes or design and development processes within is really important, because it allows you to actually embed a process of design and development, or that creative pursuit of innovation, when you're actually engaging in the innovation processes within a broader ecosystem, and having that knowledge that it is evolving will then shape how you might approach the certification endeavor. So for example, you might be certified in one particular context, but are your processes, are the design and development processes themselves aligned to those participatory and co-design processes that would be required in the context of, for example, 2089? What are your engagement strategies like? Are you co-designing in a uniform fashion across all of your product sets or across particular modules? And how you approach that certification endeavor might dictate what aspect of your operation is actually certified. So we've got that in mind, and then we can also draw back to the type, or link back to the type of innovations themselves, and also look to some of the examples that we... Sorry, was that a question, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is also what I heard from what you said, Dr. Abbas, and also Katina. Surely, we can't stop at certification, and perhaps there is a need to also be able to validate the process that's being followed within the organization, so that they are taking the essential steps. Perhaps I'm, putting it too lightly compared to the intensity of the problem, but I appreciate your responses.
Thank you.
I have one last question. I have heard about the fact that 2089 developed a set of use cases. Perhaps you did mention it in your talk and I missed it. I've seen that there is a document that came out which had a set of use cases around 2089.
There was a wonderful effort there. The case studies followed the commencement of the standard. So we launched on November 30th, 2021, and by March, the wonderful IEEE Standards Association lead, Moira Patterson, had called for case studies over the December-January period. And there were a number of these. You can find them co-located on the Engage part of the website of IEEE SA, and you will find that not far from the actual standard itself. So increasingly what we're seeing are case studies, not so much of the certification, if we just try to tie this, although we're going towards that process for 2089 in the longer term. What you will find are case studies which are going to give us hope. And the case studies are not just based on service provisioning. So the service providers are not the only one with cases. We're going to see cases by government agencies that want to oversee the embedding of IEEE 2089 across their nation state. So from a top-down view, so we've got the bottom-up perspective of organizational stakeholders who offer digital services online for children or the mass market. And then we've got the top-down view, which is how the government wants to embrace 2089 in different parts of the world and see it embedded in their actual legislation at that high level that Roba showed us in the pyramid. They want to actually put it in the law, then have it in their regulation where it's explicit. They may not say the word 2089, but it's based on the framework. And then when we're talking about compliance, we can actually point to the cases and say, well, this is when something worked positively. And that's what we want to see. We want to see more positive use cases where stakeholders have embraced this standard or other standards across the world to do with children, and then have success stories about how this worked. Because currently we're pointing to case law of penalties of organizations in the hundreds of millions. And we'd rather point to those positive use cases that say, look at this success story. They turned it around, and maybe they were once penalized, and today look at them. They're actually leading the charge in embracing the different implementation of those phases that you saw. I think we're getting there, and we had some early successes, and we continue to have inquiries across the globe. Dr. Abbas and I and the whole committee at large at IEEE getting many inquiries actually about how this standard can actually be enacted. So that's something to celebrate. Thank you for that question, Sri.
No worries. So with that, first of all, I want to congratulate you for doing a standard in 2 years. I know how often that happens in IEEE. So that's an enormous heavy lifting there to get it done in 2 years. And thank you for posting the link for the relevant documents. So with that, I think I don't see any other further Q&A. I would like to wrap up this conversation. First of all, I want to thank all the presenters on behalf of the IEEE Standards Association. I'm the practice lead for the foundational technologies practice within the IEEE, which looks at a lot of these aspects around building trust in systems. So it was kind of a design approach where I had Ruth and you guys participate in the same panel because there is a lot of linkages between the work that's happening in the 7000 series and perhaps in 2089 and further work. So we'll continue to do more such presentations to IEEE Region 10. With that, I want to thank IEEE Region 10 for hosting us. Yeah.
Akinori has joined. Akinori-san has joined. He was late. He was not well. So can you just make the closing vote of thanks?
Absolutely. And I think Dr.
You
Zia
invite,
wanted to present
Professor
some
Akinori.
slides. Yeah.
Please don't invite Aki-san. He is not feeling well. I'll do the vote of thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zia. I will hand it over to you now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Siri. And my real appreciation and thanks to Ruth and Katina and Roba, Abbas for fantastic presentation. So many issues you have highlighted, so many things we need to pay our attention, from AI design development for the health and well-being of all the people. So many issues. I've taken notes, and that's almost about 4 pages of notes I have taken from your presentation. So it was very educational for me. I've learned a lot today from your presentation. Really, the issues which really need to be addressed to protect our future generation, both in AI and also in design and services of digital services. So thank you so much for it. I was really amazed with that graph which Roba showed about the curve between the technical change and political change, and it's increasing. The gap between those two curves are exponentially increasing, which is a big worry. But thanks to people like you who are addressing these things, and hopefully we will be able to draw attention of our decision makers and lawmakers to this widening gap between the law and soft laws. Of course, as you highlighted, these soft laws will push hard laws to be formed by lawmakers. So the work you have presented is really fundamental to develop real laws which can be implemented and which can have some consequences for people who violate those standards, which are minimum to protect our children. So thank you very much for all of you for your time and great presentation. Thank you very much. And I would also like to thank Siri for bringing these brilliant speakers today in a great talk. Thank you, Sri.
Thank you, sir. So with that, I think we will
just gather for a group photograph. We will just please switch on your cameras. All the speakers and moderators and who is there on the panelists, we can just take a shot for the group photograph. You can stop sharing. Lakshan.
The people you see
Professor
on
Akinori,
screens, these are all the volunteers who
Lakshan, you
work
can
in the
just
background to bring this webinar.
thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you
very
all.
much.
We'll
Thank
do
you
it.
all. We are
Bye-bye.
just closing down. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.